Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice. The overall theme is liberating people and the planet, intersections in economics, ecology, and religion. My name is Francisco Garcia, and I am a graduate research fellow at Wendland-Cook and a PhD student in theological studies at Vanderbilt University. We offer a warm welcome to all of our participants joining us from places near and far, and especially those who are joining us from other continents today. I'd also like to mention that this webinar is being live streamed on our Wendland-Cook Program Facebook page. Feel free to share that live stream on your social media platforms. A few weeks ago, we initiated this webinar series featuring a lively conversation about the need for collective liberation for both people and planet, how religion as we know it has often been a problem, and what solutions and actions we might begin to take. We touched on how these themes are only being reinforced in the global pandemic of COVID-19. Today, we build on that conversation with the discussion on the themes of consumption and the commons. But before we do that, we must acknowledge the current moment of outrage and uprising that is taking place in the United States in response to a litany of abuses against the Black community, and most recently, the horrific murder of George Floyd at the hands of police just over a week ago in Minneapolis. We can't speak of people's liberation, or any liberation for that matter, without speaking of the particularly urgent need for Black liberation, and how in our context, the systems of racial oppression and economic exploitation have been inseparable from the beginning. We must name how our theological and social movements can move us in this direction. In that spirit, we have offered a statement of solidarity on how Wendland-Cook intends to contribute to this effort, which can be found on our website and Facebook page. At the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice, we are investigating how religion can become part of the solution rather than remain part of the problem. Aided by liberative theologies developed in the past decades and throughout history, we see hope emerging in unexpected places. Those who are most affected by the pressures of our age are not just victims, they are also becoming agents. In this climate, we seek to contribute our part to a re-emerging spirit of solidarity that was long declared missing or impossible. Before we jump into the conversation, we want to provide a few instructions on how audience participation will work. The chat function will be open, and we encourage the posting of questions, comments, and any clarifications or technical issues you might have about the webinar. Chat comments, you should know, will be visible to everyone. We'll monitor the chat and send as many of the questions to the panelists as we can for the Q&A portion, which will take place at the end of the conversation. We'll also monitor any questions that are asked on the Facebook live stream. I'll be back at the end of the session to tell you a little bit about our upcoming webinars. But now I'd like to hand things over to Dr. Joerg Rieger, who will be moderating today's conversation and will introduce our panelists. Joerg Rieger is the director of the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice. He is Distinguished Professor of Theology and the Cal Turner Chancellor's Chair in Wesleyan Studies at the Divinity School and the Graduate Department of Religion at Vanderbilt University. Joerg?
Thank you so much for your introduction, Francisco. It's great to be here again in this webinar, and I'm really excited to be here also with our panelists that I will be introducing in just a moment. Today's webinar, we will be addressing the topics of commons and consumption. This is the second webinar in a series featuring a diverse range of voices from around the nation and the globe. And again, today we have both national and international representation with our panelists. In this webinar today, we will explore the relationship between the fight for the commons on the one hand, and capitalism's shaping of consumption on the other. We want to know what resonances there might be between democratic struggles for the commons and new kinds of consumption that differ from the exploitation of humans and nature on the other. In these webinars, we're always asking the question, of course, about religion. What role might religion play as we work this out? We know it is often part of the problem, but can religion also be part of the solution? We're hopeful, but this is something that needs some work. Before we start, let me mention that the conversations of these webinars are based on papers by our panelists for an international conference that was supposed to take place at Vanderbilt in March of this year, but had to be canceled because of COVID. We are in the process of editing and publishing these papers, so hopefully by next year you can read the various contributions to these webinars also in a book form that will be a lot more extensive with more footnotes and more arguments. So you can look forward to that. And I hope that you will check them out when the time comes. For now, let me introduce our two panelists. Terra Rowe is assistant professor in the University of North Texas in the Philosophy and Religion department. Her work focuses on critical and constructive engagements with Western religious traditions from the perspective of environmental and feminist concerns. Her first book was titled Toward a Better Worldliness, Economy, Ecology, and the Protestant Tradition, published by Fortress Press in 2017. This is the book that put her work on my radar screen, and I'm very glad I read it and I recommend it. Her current book project is titled Of Modern Extraction, Gender, Religion, and Energy, forthcoming in 2022. And its focus is on the implication of gender and energy constructs in predominant Western religious and philosophical traditions. I'm just now beginning to know Terra, and I'm so glad that our paths are beginning to cross. One thing I learned about her that impressed me was that when living in New York, she helped start an interfaith collaborative ministry grounded in theologically inspired alternative economic models called the Hudson Valley Cooperative. Our other panelist is Joerg Zachariah, who serves the Trinity Methodist Theological College in Auckland, New Zealand. In the native Maori language, this country is called Aotearoa. Joerg is a lecturer in theological studies. He has also served on the faculty of United Theological College in Bangalore in India and the Gurukul Lutheran Theological College and Research Institute in Chennai, India. His long list of publications include Decolonizing Eco-Theology, Indigenous and Subaltern Challenges. He's the co-editor of that book. Another book is The Life, Legacy, and Theology of M.M. Thomas, published by Routledge in 2016, co-edited with Monica Melanchthon. And the final book I want to mention is Alternatives Unincorporated, Earth Ethics from the Grassroots, published by Routledge in 2014. I'm so glad to see Joerg here tonight. We spent a couple of weeks together in India in the fall of 2018, where we did a national seminar on religion and labor in Bangalore and traveled to the south to Kerala together. I greatly appreciated that Joerg allowed me to participate in some of his connections there on the ground in the grassroots movement. And in India, of course, this included the National Fish Workers Federation and especially the organizing tea picker women in Kerala. That was the meeting of a lifetime that changed a lot of how I look at things and think about things. So great to be working together again. Thanks both Terra and Joerg for joining us in these turbulent times. COVID-19 is affecting us everywhere. And of course, our struggles against institutionalized racism in the United States are also making headlines, not only in this country, but around the world. Let me now begin our conversation. A common theme in our webinars, as those of you who joined us last time know, is the insight that what exploits and oppresses people is the same as that which exploits and oppresses the planet. In the Wendland-Cook Program, this is why we consider economic and ecological justice to be inextricably related. So my first question, which we ask each of the panelists in all of these webinars, is what is it that people and the planet need to be liberated from? So Terra, let me turn to you first. I know one of your projects and concerns is on consumption. What do we need to be liberated from?
Yeah, thanks, Joerg. It's a real pleasure to be here, and really appreciate being part of this conversation. And it's a great question to start with. I think it's really evident today that one of the most profound needs for liberation is from racial and gender inequalities. And we know that race, gender, and class injustice are always fully entwined with environmental justice issues and climate justice. I think what often gets overlooked are the gender and racial implications of energy production and consumption. As we all know, the climate crisis is rooted in an energy crisis. And the climate crisis not only exacerbates inequality and injustice, but it also depends on it. It's fueled by it, by these inequalities and injustices. And so I'm not convinced that science and technology can liberate us from this, or at least they alone cannot liberate us from us. And that's because in looking at the ways that in the West, at least in the modern West, that we've constructed our energy concepts and constructed our energy values, it's become clear to me that energy values, concepts, and desires, as they have emerged in the West in modernity, have been profoundly rooted in and tied to ideas and conceptions of what it means to be a fully fulfilled human being, or fully developed human being. And so there's been this consistent alignment then in the West between what it means to be a full human, fully developed human, and high energy production and consumption. And this goes as far back as Aristotle, with the term that he introduced, energeia. Through the Middle Ages, this term was translated as actualization, as a fulfillment, as in terms of realization or full development. And so from Aristotle to St. Paul, who picked up on this term from Aristotle, into the modern synthesis of modern energy in the 19th century, William Thomson, who later became Lord Kelvin, he was the one that introduced the new term energy and started to combine or synthesize these traditions of Aristotle's energeia with high energy or high heat as well. And so in this tradition in the West, high energy, high heat, energeia are consistently, repeatedly aligned with the height of humanity or human fulfillment. And of course, we know that in the West, most commonly, the fulfilled human being looks like a rational male, right? And consistently then energy, and then in modernity, race as well, get defined as a lack of energeia or a lack of energy. And this materializes in really distinct ways, especially in the West, and particularly in the United States in the 20th century with oil. Ida Tarbell, for example, in an essay on religion, valorizes independent oil men as whole, as perfect men, she says, in the biblical sense. And anthropologist Leslie White argued in the 1940s then what has now become seen as orthodoxy, that full development of not just an individual, but a whole society depends on high energy production and consumption. And then most recently in current US energy policy, as recently as 2017, the current administration hosted a Make American Energy Great Again conference in Houston right after Hurricane Harvey. The stated goal of that conference was not just of US energy independence, but worldwide energy dominance. And interestingly, the motivations given for that were not primarily economic, they were moral. That the US has a moral obligation to help less developed countries develop fully through their energy consumption. And so energy access is a justice issue. Indeed, there are certain minimum levels of energy necessary for human well-being, but what contexts of high energy production and consumption like the US need to be liberated from is a deeply rooted sense in the Western thought and religion that human fulfillment depends on high energy production and consumption.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for that opening statement, Terra. There's a lot to be explored here, and I want to come back to that in a minute. Let me turn to George next. George, what do you think? What is it that people and the planet need to be liberated from?
First of all, Joerg, thank you for this wonderful opportunity. Before I respond to these questions, I think it is important for us to develop a new problematization of the crisis that we face today. In my view, the crisis that we face today is caused by the colonization of the commons. What do I mean by commons? Commons are nature's gift to the community of creation. They are shared, protected, and nurtured by the community for mutual flourishing. They signify an organic connection between land, water, forest, and subsistence communities who are marginalized by the prevailing social order. Commons are also intertwined with the struggles and aspirations of the commoners as they sustain each other. In this sense, commons are geographical spaces inhabited and nurtured by subsistence and marginalized communities. People and the planet need to be liberated from the colonization or decommoning of the commons. Colonization of the commons happens through the commoditization of the commons. The British enclosure movement can be considered as the forerunner of decommoning. Pastures, forests, and water bodies used by subsistence communities were stolen and declared private property by the kings and aristocracy. Accumulation by dispossession is the mantra of decommoning. In our times, every day, commons are converted into commodities and capital for corporate plunder. Along with settler colonialism and neoliberal capitalism, we also identify racism at work in decommoning. The Dakota Access Pipeline project in the US and the Maori land alienation happening here in Aotearoa, New Zealand are examples of this. In a metaphorical sense, commons offer us a countercultural paradigm to the logic of the market economy. It is a paradigm of an alternative social ethics of just and equitable social, economic, racial, and ecological relationships. They offer a guardianship of shared responsibility and obligation.
Well, thank you so much for your statement here, George. Let me follow up with a few comments here and also questions. If you think about what both of you were talking about, there's a history to it that goes back for hundreds, if not thousands of years, right? There's the question of ideas, philosophy, theology, religion plays a role. But then there is also the question of these various colonizing forces. George, you talked about colonization, right, of the commons. You mentioned the British Empire. There are other empires we could mention. And then, of course, both of you also talked about race. Race is not just an idea, but it's a reality, and it has a long history, as we're experiencing in the United States at the moment, a very powerful one that affects us all, whether we realize it or not. So as you start looking at these various factors, and I really appreciate that all of you talked about gender, race, colonialism, capitalism, all coming together. What is it that you think that people today might be overlooking the most? You know, is there something that you would like to tell your students or perhaps an audience? This is the sort of thing that might be most important in what you are addressing here. And let me go back to Terra and then to George again.
Sure, so just some key pieces of, to summarize, is that what you're looking for, Joerg?
Well, really, I mean, if somebody asks you, you know, there's a very complex picture that you're drawing, Terra, but in that picture, what exactly are sort of one or two main points that you think that people are not grasping, say, in the United States at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that that has become clear to me is that, I mean, we think of energy as something that is just, that we have the science of energy, we think of it as something natural, objective. And there's just some really fascinating new research about the religious kind of influences on the modern science of energy. And I've really been looking at the history of colonization and race, and how that influenced our concepts of extraction and energy. And so I think what I really wanted to highlight for people is that our energy values, our energy practices, our habits, these things that we just take for granted, they have a history. They have a past, they have been constructed. And so therefore we can deconstruct them. We can think of them otherwise.
When you talk about consumption, this is one more question for you, Terra. You know, we think about consumerism as something that oftentimes gets mentioned. When we think about consumerism, though, what I find in religious communities and other places, we oftentimes blame consumers. You know, they should not be consuming so much. You know, they're doing all of this. And so the problem is then the individual consumer, and what fades from you is the actual system that entices people to consume and that pulls them back into a system that they may not even be realizing exists.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, yeah, to tie it down to individual choice misses the fact that that our desires don't start with us. Our desires are even for products, for energy, for more and more. That's not something that's natural. That's not something that's just innate. That's part of the project of capitalism. That's what it does, is it creates those desires in us. And yeah, I think exactly that's what that kind of more narrow view of the critique of consumerism is really missing.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. George, so if you had to add maybe one or two points that you think are most important when we think about the commons, what would those be?
I think we need to recognize that commons are located in the indigenous and subaltern lands. So colonization of the commons is more than an economic aggression. It is also connected with social inequalities and gender inequalities. So colonization of the commons exhibits the display of the ugliness of racial privilege. So this is something that we need to keep in mind when we engage in ecological discourses, ecological, theological, eco-theological reflections, and also ecological activism. So there's a need for an intersectional analysis in our engagement with the ecological issues, ecological problems. And also we need to think about broader alliances of different social movements, identity-based social movements or social movements of different communities. So there is a need to bring together all these movements. This is not a single issue problem. So we need to join together and strive together to address this problem.
So it is ultimately a question of movements and building solidarity, I guess, around these movements. Yes, please, Terra, go ahead.
George, one of the things that I really appreciated in your opening comments is you mentioned responsibilities. And I think that's one of the common critiques and oversimplifications of the commons in the West, is that the commons are just, I think in the West, we view them individualistically, and we view them only based on rights, my right. And so then we get, critiques of the commons like Garrett Hardin, who, is concerned that we're just gonna everybody's just gonna consume everything then if it's all common. But I think what I really appreciated about what you pointed out is that it doesn't just include rights, but they're also commons, understood rightly, include responsibilities as well.
Yeah.
This may be a good moment to shift gears and to move on to the second major question, which is obviously about religion. So once you bring religion into the conversation, of course, we keep saying that religion is part of the problem, but how is it part of the problem, and how, of course, especially might it become part of the solution? I mean, that's of course one way to respond to the question of values, but maybe there's more going on. So let me put this question to Terra first, and then follow up with George. What is religion doing here? Well, how is religion, or how might it be helping in addressing what we're dealing with?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly a long history of that we can demonstrate that religion has oftentimes, especially in the West, Christianity in particular, has been more part of the problem than part of the solution. In terms of what I'm looking at in particular, energy consumption and production, too often throughout the in Christian thought and in the West, associations have been drawn between rationality, masculinity, high energy, and those paired with what it means to be a full human being. And this alignment oftentimes gets sacralized and moralized rather than challenged. An example, just a fascinating, I think, example of that is that when oil was discovered in the United States in the 1860s, oil was seen as times, it was portrayed at times given a redeemer-like status, even given Christ-like figuration. A perfect example of this is John J. McLaurin's 1896 sketches in crude oil. It's still today presented as an oil history, as a reliable oil history, but as I read it, this is a salvation history that culminates with civilization, with the height of humanity in the West. And so McLaurin identifies oil as the star of the East and explains that just as the gospel began in the East with the intention of global redemption, so too, and he quotes John Wesley here, so too petroleum, he says, can claim in the words of John Wesley that the whole earth now is my parish. So yeah, there's many examples where religion is part of the problem, but it also can be part of the solution. And I think the beauty of studying religion and philosophy is that you get a sense that of just how profoundly diverse philosophical traditions and religious traditions are. And so just as much as Christianity in the West has heightened high energy aligned with full humanity, we also have traditions in Christianity of theology of the cross, as where God, according to that theology, is seen as most profoundly revealed to humanity in the absence of triumph, in failure, in weakness, and in oppression. Or Holy Saturday, and I've learned here, especially from Shelley Rambo and Karen Bray, who point out that Holy Saturday has what I would call it just a different energy to it, an energy not of progress toward development, but of attending, keeping vigil, of waiting, contemplating, being with and not rushing on. And so these are places where alternatives to progressive growth-based energies of industrial modernity can emerge from within the Christian tradition. And it can't be just individual, but these energies can be organized, they can be coordinated and strategized, allowed to infuse systemic structures as well.
I'll follow up with this in just a minute, Terra, with a question about examples. Maybe we can tell some of the stories that are also connected to this. How do we see this happening? How is this embodied? But let me pose the same question to George now. George, where do you see religion not only as the problem, but maybe also as part of the solution in your own work, in your own context?
Of course, religion is part of the problem. As Lynn White rightly observed, the Judeo-Christian tradition bears a huge burden of guilt for the current crisis. The imperial motives of subdue and domination that we find in the first creation story offers us an understanding of human vocation which legitimizes decommoning and the commoditization of the planet. Even though the doctrine of discovery is a legal doctrine, it is a Christian doctrine which legitimized colonialism, settled colonialism, white supremacy, and the colonization of the commons. There have been attempts to redeem religion and try to develop or propose alternative readings of sacred texts to help us in our campaigns to liberate people and planet. But it is also important for us to critically evaluate our dominant eco-theologies and religious environmentalism. Concerns such as wilderness preservation, pristine nature, population explosion, and biocentrism, vegetarianism are the major themes of the mainstream eco-theologies and religious environmentalism. This misanthropic approach is evident in the recent theological discussions on Anthropocene. Further, a methodological commitment to affirm the agency of the commoners, the indigenous and the subaltern communities, and their epistemological significance is missing in our mainstream eco-theologies and religious environmentalism. Their inability, or rather reluctance, to recognize the correlation between social location and access to ecological wellness and well-being exposes the racial, patriarchal, and class bias of the dominant eco-theologies. That's why James Cone had to ask bluntly, whose earth is it anyway? So I think we need to keep these things in mind when we say that religion has the potential to be an ally in our campaigns. But that does not mean that religion has no role in liberating people and the planet. Religion is a potential ally in this process. But for that, we need to decolonize our eco-theologies. It requires the commitment to convert to the commons and the movements of the communities at the grassroots. So unless and until our eco-theologies are willing to have this conversion experience, I don't think that the religion can be an ally in our struggles. Perhaps in that process, commons and social movements will become our theological texts, new theological texts to inform us in this process. And social movements need to be understood as a new ecclesia happening in our times.
Thanks. I'll come back to that also in a moment, George, asking you for some examples. But now for Terra, thinking about, say, Saturday before Easter, this Holy Saturday as a moment where, maybe something could change in the United States for the most part. I guess Saturday is when people do some shopping probably for Easter Sunday. So if you look at what religious communities are practicing, that may not be a widespread practice. I mean, it's a great idea, something that might have to be put into practice perhaps. But if somebody asks you about where do you see some examples of actually religious practices, that build these alternatives, that help people sort of deal with energy in a more responsible way and maybe in a happier, healthier way, what would you name?
I think some of the examples that come to mind first for me are examples of farming communities. And of course, we know farming and food production, this is very much linked to issues of racial inequality, but also of climate justice, right? And some of the farms that I've worked with, Sister Grove is one that I've just linked up with in Texas, but also Soulfire Farm in New York. These are farms that are deeply rooted in spirituality, either religion or spirituality, and they see this connection to the earth in deeply spiritual, religious ways that build community, that build connections, and where religion flows into agricultural practice, forming community, and the agricultural practices practice brings, the community together. Yeah, so I see this on farms in terms of, liturgical practices. I think that, whether we're working in the garden, working on the farm, or experiencing community worship and liturgy, these are places that form our desires. They form our habits, our aims and goals in life. And so the, worship services like Easter Vigil, where we go through the entire kind of creation, redemption, history, and it's about waiting, attending, and for Karen Bray and Shelley Rambo, that time is, I've learned from them, is really precious to just learn to be in that moment and to wait and not to press forward towards redemption, towards the triumph of Sunday. And so I think these, whether it's gardening, agricultural practices, or the liturgies, these are ways that the communities are being formed and our desires are being altered as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. We're now getting some questions, beginning to get some questions from the audience, and I would like to encourage you, if you're listening, if you have questions, put those in the chat. We will be getting to them in just a moment after sort of moving through this section of our conversation. I want to turn back to George before we open it up to questions, and also ask this question about examples. George, you've been talking about decolonization, and if you think about decolonization, it could be seen as a very big move. It could be seen as the liberation struggle of a whole country. It could be seen as the liberation struggle, of whole parts of the world against the colonizing forces. But if you combine that sort of with grassroots practices, perhaps religious practices on the ground, I'm thinking maybe, of the Fish Workers Federation, the tea leaf picker women in Kerala. What would you see there? What would you point out? How are grassroots religious communities engaging in this decolonization as well, and therefore helping to liberate people in the planet?
Coming from India, a multicultural and multireligious context, it is not that easy to address this issue. But I would like to say that many of the activists and the people who are involved in the decolonizing movements are friends and communities involved in the process of commoning are inspired by their respective faith. So their respective faith tradition inspire them to engage in this movement. So what we are thinking of religion in the Indian context is a larger coalition of friends from different faith traditions and no faith to come together and develop interfaith coalitions to protect life and nurture life. So in that process, these friends, they reclaim some of the religious symbols, religious practices, religious rituals as part of the movement, and they use them with a different meaning for a different purpose. So religion is being used at the grassroots movements as a decolonizing tool to bring about healing and restoration to both people and the planet. So that is what is happening in the Indian context. So that's how I would like to look at this whole issue of religion's role in these movements for restoration and healing.
And so what you're also saying, I think, which is crucial, is that we need to talk about religion, not just in terms of Christianity, but interreligiously, because there are colonizing forces in many places. And then there's the resistance also happening that needs to happen much more broadly than, maybe a few people of this religion or of that religion. We need to find ways of responding together as well. Terra, I saw you had a response.
Yeah, I just, one of the things I wanted to pick up on, George, that you mentioned was, if I heard you right, it sounded like you were saying, and this idea hadn't occurred to me before, of creating new theological texts out of these communal organizing resistance movements. I think that's a fascinating idea and a fascinating way to think about the project of theology. Of creating new sacred texts for these movements, and that, of course, as you're pointing out, becomes even more important when we're talking about intra-religious movements, right? Ways that, since we all have different texts or non-texts, constructing them together, constructing these narratives together, and then and seeing that as a theological project and as the construction of sacred texts, I think it's a really exciting idea.
Yeah, our religious texts are helping the individuals to get involved in this decolonizing process, to reclaim the commons. But at the same time, in that process, the social movements are emerging, and the social movements are offering us themselves as a theological text.
Yeah.
So to decolonize our eco-theologies, we need to consider social movements as theological texts, and we need to recognize their epistemological significance in our own researches, in our own academic work to develop new eco-theologies.
Cool.
Yeah, great. Let me open it up and bring to you some of the questions that were raised by the audience as we were talking, and to some degree, some of the questions I think we've already been addressing. But here's a question for George, sort of following up on our conversation just now. From the Indian context. So somebody wonders when the government, this is talking about the Indian government, does not recognize certain groups of people as people, like for instance, Northeastern people in India, that live in mainland Indian cities now. How can this systemic issue then be addressed, right? Of course, here the question is, what about the government? Of course, this is a question that could also be raised to the US government, right? If we have governmental forces that do not recognize certain groups of people as fully human or as deserving the same kinds of justice as everybody else, what do we do? And again, maybe is there something that religion would have to contribute?
I think that's an important question. That's why I said we need to have an intersectional approach when we try to engage with this question of what will liberate the people and the planet. So racism is part and parcel of the Indian mindset. We call it casteism, or caste system. That's our original sin. Similarly, we also have indigenous, tribal, Adivasi communities in different parts of the country, including the northeast part of the country. So they are facing racial discrimination based on caste. So in that context, how would we reformulate our understanding of liberation of people and planet? How would we envision an eco-theology in the Indian context of casteism and racism? So these are important questions that we need to grapple with. And there we need to go beyond the traditional methodological frameworks of doing eco-theology and to engage with these communities who are experiencing marginalization because of their ethnicity and their own identity, and develop an alternative eco-theology that will combine all these struggles, the struggles against racism, casteism, and struggles for ecological integrity.
And I guess part of what I also hear you say, George, is that in this, nobody can go it alone. And this is not just one or the other group. And maybe especially important too, that the people who are most affected also could have some sort of agency, right? This is not just doing things for others, but really figuring out what is it that these colonized communities have endured, and where is it that they have always provided resistance, and where could they guide us now? I think that would be an important question for the United States also to ask. How are these marginalized communities now, especially, you know, in the current struggle that we're all aware of, how could, say, the Black community become part of what leads us out of this, you know, part of what guides us, also maybe part of what energizes us, which leads me to some of the questions that were raised. I'm combining some of the questions now for Terra. So earlier on, you talked about the generation of desire, right? So consumption is not just a matter of sort of individuals doing certain things, but there's a desire that's produced by the system, by the dominant powers, maybe by capitalism, if you want to name it. How do we produce alternative desires, right? How does it happen that people now can empower themselves differently? You know, you were talking about energy use, oil, dominant energy. I would ask, you know, where is alternative energy emerging? Where do you see it happening?
Yeah, I think one of the things, I mean, if we hear a lot about alternative energy, and one of the things I've been really trying to push myself to think of is, of course, alternative energy oftentimes is thought of in terms of scientific technological solutions, but what are those alternative energies that need to be produced? Something that's been really highlighted for me living in the pandemic is the way that certain kinds of energies have been pathologized. Slower patterns of life, speech, and thought. We see this in colonized communities, in marginalized communities, that these patterns of speech and thought and life that are less productive, less efficient, less driven for action, are marginalized, even seen as less moral, or, you know, less human. And in a neoliberal capitalist context, these energies, they're not just devalued or pathologized, but as I said, they're seen as less moral. And so I'm thinking here about Jack Halberstam's The Queer Art of Failure, or I mentioned before Karen Bray's, she's a political theologian, her book Grave Attending. So Bray's book is a great example of a resource for thinking about the theoeconomic forms of redemption that we have available to us in neoliberalism, and then what modes of living and feeling get marginalized, repressed, or pathologized. And so I think it's really interesting that it turns out that these unproductive, unredemptive modes of living and patterns of life are exactly the kind of energies that we need to embrace, to stay well, and to live well, confined to small spaces in the pandemic. But they're also the kinds of energies that need to be embraced to address energy-driven climate crisis as well.
I think one of the key questions here, a lot of people think about the topics that we're discussing as mainly moral issues, you know, where you have to force yourself to make a difference, you know, where you have values that are out there, maybe in a book or maybe in a program, that you must force yourself, push yourself to enact. And then it becomes almost impossible, you know, how do we do it all, right? Where do we get the energy? Where do we get the power? But what I hear both of you talking about is there is alternative sources of energy. There's movements out there that draw their energy from other places that are already happening, where it's not just a matter of some sour morality, but it's really a happy way of joining a movement, plugging into a different energy source, perhaps, you know, to use an image here, or to become part of a commons that is a very different reality. There was one question for George that asked about the commons more specifically. So when we say commons, ultimately, do we think of mostly specific groups of people, or is this ultimately a question for all of humanity? What would that look like?
Yes, ultimately it's a question for the entire humanity. But when we talk about commons, we are also talking about specific communities who live in communion with their commons. So that is very important. And interestingly, most of these communities are the communities of color or indigenous communities or subaltern communities. So you see that connection between struggles for wider social justice and struggles for economic justice, and the need for combining these two struggles, because the commoners are affected by multiple forms of oppression and marginalization.
I'm looking at the time. There are several other questions that would be very interesting and fruitful to discuss. But let me summarize some of them and put them to you and ask each of you maybe for a minute or 2 minute final statement in response to that. Back to Terra for a moment. Somebody raised a question about progress. Western concepts of progress, are oftentimes behind this dominant energy thinking that you described, right? We will have more and more. We will move to higher and higher stages of development. You're talking about something else. The question here actually suggests that maybe we should replace the word progress with the word process. I mean, how do you think about moving forward without using this dominant notion of progress? That's sort of the final question, and maybe you could make your final statement about that in relation to it.
Yeah, so I think that that process could be a really great alternative to progress. That it does need some interpretation still, right? Because process can still really lend itself to an idea of just moving in one direction. But as process theologians tell us, that's certainly not the way that it's intended, or that is ideal. And so thinking about process in ways that are profoundly interrelational rather than individualistic, rather than progress being something about moving towards individualistic aims and towards a singular goal, whether it's salvation, material or otherworldly salvation. But in the best sense, I think process really calls us to attend to those energies that don't all move in the same direction, that are coming from and that are intersecting in ways that form us in profound ways. And so those energies may, according to the progress model, look unproductive. They may look stuck. They may, but they're profoundly interrelational, and I think we could also identify them as energies of the commons. Right? These are where those places of intersection come. So yeah, I like the idea of process rather than progress.
And I guess we already talked about this earlier. You see places where this is happening. I think this is important also. So it's not just an interesting conversation among, philosophically minded people, but this is something that's really happening all around us. And you already gave us some ideas and some examples. So let me remind our listeners that there is, of course, a lot more out there, and we would encourage everybody to think about examples for that in their own lives, and then to connect to that rather than trying sort of to change the world single-handedly. Final more examples? Of course, please. Yes.
So one example that I saw in New York is churches creating a commons and treating energy as a commons. It's creating a commons by using their open fields and turning it into an open field of solar panels, and then using that way of producing energy to create a community and make moral-based decisions about how they're going to use that, who in the community is going to benefit from those, and how that energy is going to be used. So creating a commons, treating energy as a commons.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much. This is very fruitful. I wish we had a lot more time to discuss all of this, but this will get us started. So the final question for George, then, someone raised the question, taking us back to the question of colonization. And here too, we're not just talking about one religion or the other. Many religions have this colonizing spirit as part of their DNA almost, certainly as part of their history. You know, having known you for quite a few years, George, I know that you're also a person who has not lost hope. I mean, you see this problem, you see the critical points, but you also see the alternatives that religion is actually producing on the ground. Now that you're doing this work, I mean, you've done this for many years in India. Now that you're doing it in New Zealand, I understand you're seeing some hopeful developments there. Could you give maybe one or two final examples, either from India or from New Zealand, about where you see religion as part of the hope?
I propose commoning as the alternative in our times. And it is happening all over the world, initiated by the grassroots movements of the commoners. And these movements expose the toxicity of the interlocking systems of capitalism, patriarchy, racism, and ecological injustice. So that is the most important point, and we need to engage with these movements. And as I mentioned earlier, we need to consider these movements as theological texts and new ecclesia. Religion plays a major role in these groups, these movements. As I mentioned, you know, people with inspiration from their religious traditions are part of many of these movements. For example, you mentioned about the National Fish Workers Federation in India. Initially, that movement was, you know, led by Catholic priests and nuns. Similarly, you see several other movements in different parts of the world where, you know, religious people, you know, they gather inspiration from their sacred texts and engage in community development and community organization and developing social movements. So that is a reality, and that is still continuing. Regarding movements, there are several movements in our time which are in the process of contesting the dominant logic, and they're trying to engage in this work of commoning. The Zapatista movement in Chiapas is an example. The Ihumatawa movement in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it's a movement of the Maori people to reclaim their land back from the government and the corporations. Initially, the church also played a role in them losing the land. But now they are in the process of reclaiming their land, and they are trying to convert their stolen land into a commons to feed the entire community. Standing Rock is an example from the US, where, you know, different faith traditions, different denominations, they gather together in the struggle to challenge the dominant paradigm and the attempt to commoditize the water bodies of indigenous communities. So you see several movements all over the world where people are challenging the logic of market economy and proposing viable alternatives. And there we can find a new spirituality, a new faith. In fact, these movements, they are trying to occupy the commons. And in the process of occupying the commons, they are also trying to occupy their religious traditions from conservatives and fundamentalist groups. So Occupy Commons is also an Occupy faith movement, because they are reclaiming their faith to help the world, help the communities to experience healing and restoration in a better way in our times.
Thank you so much. That is a powerful closing statement. And I think what we've done here, you know, let's just give expression to that. We've reclaimed a lot of things. You know, we are reclaiming alternative economic expressions, alternative economic processes, different political systems, but we're ultimately also reclaiming religion. When people think religion is just one thing, you know, what you do, say, in traditional religious communities or say in the church on Sunday morning, there's a lot more to it. And perhaps that's not the main thing after all. We think about practices, we think about communities. we think about work that's done together. So in the process, I think all of these things get re-envisioned. And the good news is that a lot of these things are happening already. They may not get reported as much as they should, but this is why we are having these conversations. So thank you for reporting on those things, for reflecting on them, for thinking further about them. And we will do more of that in these webinars. Let me thank Terra and George and turn it back to Francisco at this point. Thanks.
Well, friends, we're so grateful that you've all joined us as we continue this important series featuring diverse perspectives on liberating people and the planet. Many are aware that the economic, ecological, cultural, and the religious problems of our times are interconnected. At Wendland-Cook, we're committed to analyzing these connections, investigating solutions, and organizing our communities based on what we've learned. The presenters, as you've seen, come from many walks of life, embodying different racial, ethnic, gender, and sexual identities. We come from different countries and backgrounds, yet all of us are involved in thinking and acting in movements of liberation. Our invitation to you is to join us and to help us understand better where we can join you. We want to thank our community sponsors in supporting this important programming: Middle Tennessee Group of the Sierra Club, Second Presbyterian Church, Southeastern Synod of the ELCA, Tennessee Alliance for Progress, 10 Green Land Conservancy, Tennessee Interfaith Power and Light, and Tennessee UMC Creation Care. As we close, we'd like to invite you to take a couple of important next steps. We'll post links in the chat, and you will also receive this information in an email that will be sent to you tomorrow. Step 1, sign up and get the word out about our next webinar on Wednesday, June 24th at 11 a.m. Central Time. This webinar features a conversation with Jeremy Posadas and Timothy Eberhardt. The discussion will be moderated by Joerg Rieger, PhD student in environmental sociology at Boston College, and our Wendland-Cook Program founder, Joerg Rieger. Step 2, follow our blog series currently featuring perspectives on economics, religion, and justice as it relates to the current pandemic. Step 3, sign up for the Wendland-Cook Program email list and like us on Facebook. And then finally, we ask that you fill out the survey to give us feedback about today's webinar. We thank you again for listening, for commenting, for engaging in this critical conversation. Thank you to our panelists, Terra, George, and to our moderator, Joerg. And we wish you all a wonderful rest of the day or evening, wherever you are, and see you next time. Thank you.